He was on a mission of honor, escorting a fallen soldier home. But when two airport officers tried to stop him, mocking, belittling, and questioning his right to be there, they had no idea who they were dealing with. What happened next would be remembered forever. The airport was a sea of movement, a blur of hurried footsteps, rolling suitcases, and the steady hum of announcements echoing through the terminal. Families reunited, business travelers buried themselves in their phones, and flight attendants in crisp uniforms strode past with the effortless grace of routine. Amidst the chaos, a single figure stood still. A black man in a pristine military uniform, shoulders squared, eyes steady. His hands, calloused from years of service, clutched a set of official documents, a clearance letter stamped with the insignia of the Department of Defense. But his grip wasn't from nerves. It was from something deeper, a duty, a promise. He had escorted brothers in arms before, but this one was different. This soldier, this man, was family, not by blood, but by bond. They had shared meals in the desert heat, whispered jokes in the dead of night, and fought side by side in places most people would never dare to step foot in. Now, he was bringing him home. One last time. The air inside the terminal was thick with artificial coolness, but the weight pressing down on his chest had nothing to do with temperature. He exhaled slowly, adjusting the flag-draped case at his feet as he approached the check-in desk, reserved for military personnel. That was when the trouble began. Two police officers stood near the priority lane, their uniforms crisp, their postures relaxed in the way only men who believed they owned the space around them could be. They were white. They were comfortable. And they noticed him immediately. One of them, tall, broad, with a smirk that never quite reached his eyes, stepped forward, blocking his path. "Where do you think you're going?" The officer's voice was casual, almost amused. The man in uniform remained still, his expression unreadable. "I'm escorting a fallen soldier." His voice was measured, firm. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the clearance letter, extending it without hesitation. The second officer snorted, taking a lazy glance at the paper before exchanging a look with his partner. "Uh-huh," he muttered, "and I'm the president." The taller officer tilted his head. "We've seen people try to use fake papers before. What makes you so special?" There was no anger in the soldier's eyes. Not yet. Just patience. The kind forged through discipline, through years of understanding that sometimes the best response was silence. A young airline attendant nearby hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of her keyboard. She had seen military escorts before. She had seen the way airline staff usually went out of their way to accommodate them. Something about this interaction felt off. She parted her lips as if to say something, but the taller officer turned his head ever so slightly, catching her movement. She shrank back. A few passengers had slowed their steps, sensing tension in the air. But in an airport, a place where people had places to be, where personal space was both sacred and fleeting, no one intervened. And then, it happened. The soldier shifted, just slightly, enough for the small silver insignia pinned to his uniform to catch the light. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to an untrained eye, but not to a man who had served. An older gentleman waiting nearby stiffened, his eyes locked onto the emblem. Recognition flickered across his face. He sucked in a sharp breath, his posture straightening instinctively, as if years of civilian life had momentarily peeled away. This man wasn't just a soldier, he was something else. But before the older man could speak, before the young airline attendant could gather the courage to step forward, the taller officer took another step closer. "You're not getting on that flight." His smirk widened, completely unaware of the mistake he had just made. The soldier didn't move. He didn't flinch. He had been in worse situations, in places where words weren't the weapons of choice, where the air was thick with something far deadlier than arrogance. And yet, as he stood in the middle of that airport terminal, a uniformed officer blocking his path like a self-appointed gatekeeper, something inside him hardened. The taller officer took another step, deliberately closing the distance between them. His partner leaned back slightly, crossing his arms, watching, waiting. "I said," the taller one repeated, drawing out each syllable like he was speaking to a child. "You're not getting on that flight." The soldier's jaw tightened. He held the officer's gaze, calm, unwavering. Then, just as steadily, he extended the documents again. "My orders are clear," he said, voice firm but level. "I am escorting a fallen soldier home. Step aside." But the officer didn't even glance at the papers this time. Instead, he reached out, gripping the edge of the soldier's sleeve between his thumb and forefinger, inspecting the fabric as if it were something foreign, something unearned. His smirk deepened. "Fancy uniform," he mused. "Bet it makes people treat you real special, huh? But see, around here, a uniform doesn't mean a damn thing if I say it doesn't." The second officer chuckled. Maybe he thinks wearing that gives him a free pass. A flicker of something sharp flashed through the soldier's eyes, but he swallowed it down. His training had drilled restraint into him, made it second nature. The battlefield taught you when to engage and when to wait. This was a waiting game. The airport around them carried on, oblivious to the confrontation. People walked past, luggage in tow, too consumed by their own journeys to notice the silent storm brewing in the middle of the terminal. But not everyone was blind to it. The older man from before, the one who had recognized the insignia, watched with growing unease. His knuckles whitened around the handle of his carry-on. He had seen this before, too many times. The wrong kind of men flexing the wrong kind of power. And the way they were looking at this soldier, they had no idea. The young airline attendant was now shifting nervously behind her desk. Her fingers hovered over the radio clipped to her waistband. She had been trained on protocol, on what to do when a situation escalated. But this? There was no training manual for this. The taller officer exhaled dramatically, shaking his head, as if he were doing the soldier a favor. "Tell you what," he said, mock generosity dripping from his voice. "You want to get on that plane? Prove to me you're who you say you are." The second officer smirked. "Yeah. Let's see if that rank of yours actually means anything." The soldier's hands flexed at his sides. His patience was wearing thin. "I don't need to prove anything to you," he said, voice like stone. "Step aside." But they didn't move. And then, with an exaggerated sigh, the taller officer reached up, slow, deliberate, and placed a heavy hand on the soldier's chest, just above his medals. "You're not hearing me, are you?" The air in the terminal shifted. The kind of shift that comes right before a storm. A breath held, a moment stretched too thin. The older man took an unconscious step forward, about to speak. The airline attendant's hand darted toward her radio. A bystander lifted their phone, thumb hovering over the record button. And then, it happened. The soldier moved. Not much, just enough to shift his weight, enough to take a half step forward, so the officer's hand, still pressing against his chest, had no choice but to slide away. The taller officer's smirk vanished. It was subtle, but it was there. A power shift. The soldier leaned in just slightly, lowering his voice so only the two officers could hear. "I am not your problem," he said. but you're about to have one." The taller officer scoffed, but there was something else in his expression now, something unsettled. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "Sir." Heads turned. A man in an expensive suit, his airport ID swinging from a lanyard, was striding toward them. His face was tight, his pace urgent. He wasn't looking at the officers. He was looking at the soldier. And when he got close enough to see the insignia on the soldier's uniform, his expression shifted from urgency to something dangerously close to fear. "This is a misunderstanding," the man stammered. Please, allow me to escort you myself." The two officers stiffened, their superior, apologizing. To him, the soldier didn't move. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply tilted his head, looking first at the officers, then at the man in the suit. And then, finally, he took a step forward. The officers, for the first time, stepped back. The silence was deafening. The terminal, once filled with the chatter of travelers, now felt eerily still. The man in the suit, clearly someone with authority, stood frozen, his breath shallow, his gaze darting between the soldier and the two officers. The taller officer's confidence wavered. His hand twitched at his belt, but it wasn't out of instinct. It was hesitation. His partner shifted uncomfortably, as if finally sensing the weight of something bigger than their assumptions. But neither of them were ready to back down. The taller one recovered first, straightening his shoulders, as if he could still reclaim control. "Step back," he ordered, his voice sharper now, a desperate grasp at authority. "We're conducting a security check." The man in the suit turned to him, his face pale. "Do you know who this is?" The officer scoffed, though there was an edge to it. "I don't care who he is." The soldier finally spoke. "That's the problem." His voice was quiet, measured, but it cut through the tension like a blade. The second officer muttered under his breath, "This is ridiculous." Then, louder, "If he's so important, why's he flying commercial?" A murmur rippled through the bystanders. The ones who had been quietly watching, unsure if they should intervene, now began whispering among themselves. The young airline attendant was gripping the edge of her desk, her lips parted, as if she wanted to speak, but didn't know how. The older man, the one who had recognized the insignia, stepped forward. His voice, though calm, carried the unmistakable weight of someone who had seen more than his fair share of battles. "Son," he said, addressing the taller officer, "you just made the biggest mistake of your career." The officer's jaw clenched. "Stay out of this." But the older man ignored him. His eyes remained locked on the soldier. And then, in a gesture so deliberate it sent a shiver through the space, he straightened his back and raised his hand to his temple. A salute. A sharp inhale echoed from somewhere in the crowd. The soldier remained still, his expression unreadable. But something flickered in his gaze. Acknowledgement, perhaps. The taller officer let out a breath, scoffing. "What? Is this some kind of performance?" He turned to the man in the suit, exasperated. "I don't care if he's military. He's not getting through until I say so." The man in the suit swallowed hard. "You don't understand." "No, you don't understand," the officer snapped. "You think I'm just gonna let some guy in uniform waltz through security because he's got a badge and an attitude? That's not how this works." The soldier's patience had run thin. "I'm done talking," he said, stepping forward again. This time, neither officer moved to stop him. But the taller one, too stubborn, too arrogant, made a mistake. A small one, but a mistake nonetheless. He reached out, not to grab, but to shove. The soldier didn't react the way they expected. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. He simply sidestepped, shifting his weight with the kind of effortless precision that only came from years of training. The officer's hand met nothing but air. The crowd saw it. They saw how smoothly, how efficiently the soldier moved. It wasn't just a reaction, it was instinct. The murmurs grew louder. Someone whispered, "Did you see that?" The second officer, the one who had been more hesitant, paled slightly. His eyes darted back to the insignia. Recognition dawned. He took a half-step back. "Tanner," he muttered, nudging his partner. "Let it go." But Tanner, the taller officer, was too far gone, too deep into his own mistake to see a way out. "No," he hissed. "No, I'm not letting him walk away from this." He reached for his radio, his fingers curling around it like it was a lifeline. But before he could speak, a new voice entered the conversation, one that cut through the noise, through the tension, through the growing storm of consequences about to crash down. Officer Tanner. A woman's voice, sharp, commanding, unyielding, heads turned. A senior airport security official, her uniform crisp, her presence demanding respect, was striding toward them, her expression unreadable. Tanner's face twitched, but he kept his grip on his radio. "Ma'am, this man, I know who he is." Her words landed like a hammer. Tanner hesitated. "You do?" She stopped directly in front of the soldier, and then, to the shock of nearly everyone present, she saluted. Not just a casual nod of respect, a full, proper military salute. And the soldier, silent, unwavering, returned it. The entire terminal felt like it had exhaled. The older man smirked. "Now you understand." Tanner's mouth opened, closed. He looked at his partner, at the bystanders, at the uniformed woman in front of him, and finally, at the soldier. And for the first time, real fear settled in his eyes. He had lost, and he hadn't even realized when it happened. Tanner's grip on his radio loosened, his jaw clenched, the tendons in his neck tightening as he processed what was unfolding around him. The murmurs in the crowd had turned into something sharper: judgment, disbelief. The senior airport security officer, the woman who had just saluted, lowered her hand, her gaze never leaving the soldiers. "Colonel," she addressed him, voice steady, unwavering. "On behalf of this airport, I apologize for this incident." The words hit Tanner like a blow. "Colonel?" He barely had time to process before the murmurs turned into outright whispers. Did she say colonel? Like a high-ranking officer? Jesus, those cops are screwed. Tanner's partner swallowed hard, finally stepping away, putting distance between himself and the unfolding disaster. But Tanner? He still clung to whatever semblance of authority he had left. This is unnecessary," he muttered, but his voice was weaker now. "I was just doing my job." The soldier finally spoke, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Your job was to secure this airport. Your job was to uphold order, not abuse power." Tanner exhaled sharply, shaking his head, still trying to regain control. "I didn't know who you were." "You didn't care," the soldier cut in. His words were soft, but they sliced through the air like a razor. "You saw a black man in uniform, and that wasn't enough for you." The crowd had fallen completely silent now. Tanner opened his mouth, whether to deny it, to defend himself, to say something, but the senior officer spoke first. "You've made a grave mistake, Officer Tanner," she said, stepping beside the soldier. "Colonel Williams is here on a classified mission, escorting a fallen soldier home. You attempted to obstruct military orders. You harassed a ranking officer in front of dozens of witnesses." She glanced at the airline attendant, who still gripped the edge of her desk like she was watching a train wreck in real time. "Miss, do we have surveillance on this?" The woman jolted, nodding quickly. Yes, ma'am. And several passengers have been recording." Tanner's face drained of color. He could feel the walls closing in around him. The soldier took a step forward, not aggressively, not threateningly, but with a presence so commanding that Tanner instinctively stepped back. "You thought you were in control," the soldier said quietly, "but men like you never really are." Tanner's breath hitched, and then the soldier did something unexpected. He adjusted the sleeve of his uniform, straightened his posture, and stepped past him. Not with arrogance, not with triumph, but with the quiet, dignified resolve of a man who never needed to prove himself in the first place. The senior officer turned to Tanner and his partner, her expression unreadable. "You're both relieved of duty, effective immediately." Tanner's breath stuttered. "You can't." "I can." Her voice was sharp. "And I will." The second officer, pale, sweating, had enough sense to accept his fate. But Tanner? He stood there, watching as Colonel Williams walked away, past the line of stunned passengers, past the man in the suit who had been too late to stop this, past the young airline attendant who still looked too afraid to breathe. He was gone. And Tanner? He was left with nothing but silence. Tanner stood frozen. The weight of his mistake was finally settling in, pressing down on him like a crushing force. His partner had already taken a step back, distancing himself as if hoping to fade into the crowd. But there was no escaping this. The senior officer didn't wait for a response. She turned to the airport security team, her voice sharp and professional. "Escort them to the administrative office. Their badges and weapons are to be surrendered immediately." The words hit Tanner like a hammer. "Wait." But the security officers were already closing in. His partner, realizing there was no way out, reluctantly unfastened his badge and handed it over. Tanner hesitated for a fraction of a second too long before finally doing the same, his hands shaking with barely restrained frustration. The young airline attendant let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The older man, the one who had recognized Colonel Williams from the start, simply shook his head. "He gave you every chance," the older man murmured as Tanner was led away. "You did this to yourself." Tanner clenched his jaw, but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Across the terminal, Colonel Williams walked toward his gate, his steps steady, unwavering. The noise of the airport had returned. Announcements, murmured conversations, the distant hum of engines warming up for departure. But there was a difference now. People stepped aside as he passed, not out of fear, but out of respect. The young airline attendant, gathering her courage, called after him. "Sir." He paused, turning slightly. She hesitated, then straightened her posture. "Thank you for your service." For the first time that day, a small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. He gave her a nod, a simple acknowledgement, before continuing on his way. Tanner, now just another nameless face in a crowd that no longer cared about him, watched as the colonel disappeared through the terminal doors. And in that moment, he realized he hadn't just lost his job. He had lost something far greater. The plane took off as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city. From his seat, Colonel Williams gazed out the window, his reflection faintly visible against the fading light. Somewhere beneath them, a man who had once stood in his way was now left to face the consequences of his arrogance. But Williams wasn't thinking about Tanner. He wasn't thinking about the anger, the humiliation, or even the injustice of it all. He was thinking about the soldier he was bringing home. His hand rested gently on the folded flag, draped across his lap, his fingers tracing the embroidered stars. Honor, duty, sacrifice. Words that carried more weight than the empty authority men like Tanner clung to. A flight attendant passed by, pausing briefly. "Sir, would you like anything?" He shook his head. "I have everything I need." She nodded, understanding without needing to ask. The plane continued its journey, carrying him forward, not just to a destination, but to a final act of service, a promise fulfilled. Because some men don't need to prove their worth. They simply live it. What do you think? Have you ever witnessed a moment where true respect overcame arrogance? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.